I've not looked at the weather. Just
Oh my God, you need
hanging
to.
on by a string.
Good evening. We'll call to order the Planning and Zoning meeting for September 11th, 2019. You should have the agenda for tonight in front of you. Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
Make a motion to approve.
Second.
Second.
All those in favor say aye. The ayes have it. The agenda is approved. Next item on the agenda is to approve the minutes from the July 10th Planning and Zoning meeting. You should have a copy of those in front of you. Does anybody have any comments on those meeting minutes? If there's- Go
I
ahead.
would like my comments reflected. I think I spoke with Fran over email. I had concerns about density
Okay, but
reflected in the minutes.
Fran, I think, is it my understanding that the minutes have changed because of the fact that we're recording the meetings
Well, it doesn't,
through
it
video?
didn't change. It's just that we don't have to note comments, only actions and motions, but I try to do the best I can. I can't do like everyone's comments, but I can put them in there.
Okay,
Yeah, because it's, it was a motion. I mean, we're not always going to agree on every motion, so I think it's appropriate if there are some people that don't agree to record it.
What was the
So could
motion
you
that you
send
were
me that
talking
in
about?
like an
Or
email?
the
Because
consensus.
you
Yeah,
send it-
I did.
Because those, I couldn't hear you like a lot of times and over on this side. So if you go on the website, you can't really hear a lot of times. So,
I totally understand.
Okay.
I totally get that.
Okay.
I just want that recorded, just for record. Minutes are a record.
do we want to come back then and do you want to amend those minutes? Do we need to amend those and approve them the next meeting?
That would be
I'd suggest that maybe you bring that subject up at this meeting, and then we can include it in the minutes for this meeting rather than going back to the last meeting and amending.
Yeah, I don't know if that's not minutes as I understand them, but maybe you can just record my comment about the minutes in this meeting
yeah.
for these minutes.
No, she's talking about the minutes from the July. We didn't meet in August. No.
No.
We didn't meet in August, Chris.
We had two works that we had a work.
We had a meeting
Yeah.
and a work session, and then we took a hiatus.
Two in
July.
July.
In July.
We have 2 meetings in July.
Right, that's it.
Yeah.
The
Well, we
10th.
had we had a work session and a planning and zoning meeting.
Oh, so there are no minutes from the work session?
No, they're coming up next.
Next, you got them right there. You should have two. July
Sorry.
10th and
Okay.
31st.
Okay. I just looked through the entire pile and I only thought they were July 10th minutes. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I just didn't see anywhere where density was mentioned as a concern, and that was brought up extensively, so I think it should be part of the minutes.
Mr. Chair, I'm confused. And are we amending the minutes or are we recording Lori's?
I would like to,
comments
I
in
would
this
like to
meeting?
record Lori's comments.
In this meeting?
this meeting.
And not amend the prior meeting?
I would.
minutes? Okay.
So is there a motion to approve the minutes as written, and we'll note Lori's comments as part of the record tonight?
I'll move to approve the minutes of July 10.
Is there a second? All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay. The ayes have it. Next item on the agenda is the minutes from the July 31st work session. Is there any comments about the minutes presented from the work session? Hearing none, is there a motion to approve the minutes from the work session dated July 31st?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes, July
Is there a
31st.
second?
question about the
Sure.
minutes. Are
Sorry.
these the minutes we're amending? I'm now confused myself.
No,
Are we
we're-
amending these or what are we doing?
We are not. We will,
Right, I guess the question is, what is the purpose of the minutes? Is it to record a session or is it, I mean, I've been doing minutes a long time.
I think, my personal feeling is, I think these minutes are to record any formal action that we take with regards to approving a plan or a site plan that's in front of us. A lot of what we've done is just have discussion about the development of the comprehensive plan, and nothing's formally being approved or disapproved. It's really just, it's a discussion as we try to learn more and understand about the development of the different chapters of the comprehensive plan. And none of that is like a record of decision that we have done as a planning body. And that's, I think, why we have, that's not a formal decision that we've taken a by-person vote to do that needs to be recorded in the minutes, is my personal feeling.
Look, can I ask a question?
Sure.
So I'm just hypothetically in this meeting, let's say we're having a discussion and there's a motion and I disagree with the outcome and there a vote and my vote is recorded as not agreeing. That would go in the minutes. Would it
Yes.
also be appropriate for me to specify, I would like noted in the minutes, the reason for my disagreement is A and B? Would that be a reasonable thing for someone to do hypothetically in the minutes?
And you do that.
Right. So we know minutes do not capture the entire conversation, but it would be reasonable for a commission member to request that specific comments are recorded in the minutes. So would it then follow that it's reasonable for a commission member to request that minutes be amended for the same reason? Because it seems to me that it kind of follows that it would.
You can amend them right here.
Right, and
Yeah.
that's what I'm trying to do, because these minutes say that the consensus from the
talking
planning
about?
commission spoke in favor of it and it supports the plan. A draft of the plan will be sent out to the planning commission
Which
soon.
ones are you talking about? 10 or 31? 10 or,
This one is 10.
okay, so we've already done 10. So we're 31 we're dealing with now?
Yeah, it's my mistake. I thought that was in 31, so I would like to amend 10, even though we've already done it.
Right, I got that one.
I would just like the
Well,
like
can
the
you
minutes to
articulate the
reflect.
specific language you want put in the minutes?
I did. I sent it over email, and I think I sent it to everyone.
I think we should have
We should have
We
it
should
in the
have it
minutes.
here as part of the meeting so we can record it accurately. Just because the email exchange isn't formal,
Okay,
isn't formal.
You can just tell me what you want me to say, and I will put it down here, and then I'll amend it.
You can just say that I had concerns about the density involved with the proposed plans and the, let's see, they're right here. And the high density types of housing.
Mr. Chairman, I'll move that we reconsider the approval of the July 10th minutes.
All those,
Is there a
is there a
second?
second? All those in favor say aye. So we are reconsidering the minutes of
10th.
July 10th planning and zoning meeting.
Now, I would like to see it in the minutes before I vote to approve it or not approve it.
Okay, so we'll delay
Delay
approving the
approval.
minutes of the July 10th planning and zoning meeting till they're reissued at our next meeting. Got it, Fran?
They can be in the minutes from this meeting,
Yeah, but
but I can state in this meeting here in August, I can
we'll
put.
we'll reissue the minutes for July 10th and then take a vote on the next time we get together.
Right.
Is there any, so we will not approve. You're not going to
Not
take
addressing-
action on approving the minutes of July 10th planning and zoning session.
Correct. I move that we approve the minutes of July 31.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. The ayes have it. The minutes from the July 31st comprehensive plan work session are approved. You all that, Fran? Are you clear? Okay. Okay. Next on the agenda is the comprehensive plan discussion. Chris, I know you have some material you want to talk through.
Yeah,
Start with that.
sure.
Well, can I take 1 minute of your?
You can-
Never mind.
Your
I'm going to
meeting.
get at the end. Nope, I'm going to get at the end. It'll be our wrap up. I have two things when we wrap up tonight.
Okay. What you have is I would say, version 2 of the land use chapter, still very much a draft, but we handed out this at the last meeting or sent it to you just before that meeting. You probably saw that there are a number of changes on this draft. The most significant deals with the whole impact of sea level rise and how we respond to it or not. And it was so that I developed that section further, perhaps refined it a bit, but I did it in light of the maps that we were able to finally compile. And we worked with the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy, the Eastern Shore Regional GIS Cooperative at Salisbury University. And these maps are unique in all the state, that they show not only the expected sea level rise, the predicted sea level rise in 2050 and 2100, but the layered on that, the extent of flooding in those years. In fact, they show it at 3 levels. We could have done it at multiple levels. They have the elevation models in the forecasting there at the Salisbury University. But I selected the 10%, 1%, and 0.2%. The 0.2 is often considered the 500-year storm. The 1% is the 100-year storm. And the 10%, you could consider it like the 10-year storm. What 10% basically means is that in any given year, those areas shown as 10% on the map are likely to flood or have a 10% chance of flooding. Floodwaters will either be contained within that area, that blue area, or exceed that area. And I think that is a really important element to sea level rise, because it really essentially maps out areas that are at higher risk over time as the levels of the sea increase. So you see that in my recommendations, I addressed some of that and addressed the different way of looking at what properties that are in floodplain, and suggested that it's time, perhaps over the next 5 or 7, 10 years, to redo the way we treat development and regulation within these floodplain areas, and that the 100-year floodplain may not be a sufficient geography to regulate for public health and safety, that the area might actually be beyond that 100-year floodplain, and to encompass areas that are going to be within that 10% probability zone. Again, the 10% probability zone is 10% greater than the 100-year flood zone. So, but that doesn't really happen until it gradually emerges, so that by 2050, that's likely to happen. Now, the caveat here to fully understand, and this gets to Bob's point, and he raised it at the last meeting, and I thought it was really valid. Whatever really what's the validity of these projections or these predictions? 2050 is a long way out. Certainly 2100, 80 years from now, is quite a distance. And we talked about that a bit, and I posted the Climate Change Commission reports. They're in the box. Dropbox. The numbers that we have, 2050 and 2100, correspond to 2.1 feet and 5.7 feet above the 2000 base. That's the baseline. That 2.1 number, universally among the people making these projections and multiple studies, is solid. It's been projected multiple times, and as we get closer, they keep converging onto that 2.1, 2.2, something 2.4. Of course, the difference between 0.1 and 0.4 is big when you're talking about the depth of water. But when we're talking about the aerial extent of it, it's not really that important to make a distinction between those two. Which leads me to think that it's really important for us to know what that area is, where water levels are predicted by 2050, and the consequent floodplains that are associated with them. And not only should we plan for it, but we should begin thinking about how to regulate development within those areas, because that's a reasonable likelihood. Certainly as reasonable as floods within the 100-year floodplain. That's where we're headed. By contrast, the 2100 number is far removed, and because of that, the level of predictive accuracy is lower. It's not to say that we should ignore it, but I don't know that we can say conclusively that 5.7 feet is going to be the rise. The Maryland Climate Change Commission's report documented that the number ought to be around 5.7. Their second report changed that number a little bit. I think they dropped it to something less than 5.7, maybe 5 or 5.1. But all the modeling and data that we used for these maps exist only for that 5.7, because that was the number a couple years ago based on the projections, and no one has updated their models to the more refined projection. Every 5 years they update these projections, and presumably they zero in closer to what might happen. 5.7 feet is substantial, and as we've seen in all these maps, it affects the town's development potential and conservation potential. It affects everything, the look and feel of the town. The scientists that informed the Maryland Climate Change Commission believe that 5.7 may be not enough to plan for, that the next 44 years from now, they'll be updating the forecast, and they're holding out the real possibility that the number will be larger, because the things that are in motion contributing to sea level rise are not going to be reversed in any short period of time, and presumably will accelerate. They're saying that it's actually accelerating, which leads me to think that 2100 number ought to be understood and made part of the municipality's thinking about development planning and design. It should be considered, so just leave it at that, but not a regulated, strong, consistent, no development within this area, no change of use or no redevelopment. But we should consider it and sort of begin planning for that possibility, leaving options open so we can respond to it appropriately, or for the next planning commission in later years. And that's ultimately what planning is. It's really looking out to the future and making sure future planning commissions and planners have opportunities to respond appropriately without excessive public costs or compromises. You sort of weigh those things. So that being said, my thinking about this whole sea level rise is evolving as I'm immersing myself into this. My initial response, and this is perhaps a fault of town planners universally, is to see changes like this as a threat to public health and safety and respond by saying, we need to regulate, we need to prevent, or we need to buffer, and only after sort of involving myself in this data and these reports and these maps, and the objectives of the town and the other goals that a community has. Only after doing that did I begin to see that this can actually be an opportunity long term. That sure, we want to protect within that 2.1 foot range, but long term is also an opportunity to create options to build on the town's heritage and allow development that builds on the recreational resources, that infrastructure and landscape and architecture will have the freedom to respond to these conditions over time, so that the town continues to evolve as a coastal community. I mean, that's the reality of this. So it really says that sea level rise is not an existential threat to Chesapeake Beach. It's something that the town has dealt with. The town is built within this floodplain, within this estuary where we are today. A lot of bad choices we can judge in hindsight were made filling in wetlands to build affordable housing for people, or building too close to the water in high velocity flood areas. The long-term future can, in thinking about where floods are going to be, can be such that those decisions aren't made anymore. In fact, that people are humanely moved from the most risk places, allow market forces to change the character of that area where Kellum's Field is and all that, so that something akin to the heritage of the community evolves, which I think is a preferred approach than simply saying we can't do anything with that area. It's off limits to any developments, off limits to any investment. It's off limits to anything because we fear something that may happen 80 years from now. So that's kind of the theme of where I was headed in writing this. I just want to share my thinking with you about that. You may judge that to be Pollyannish and want a more restrictive approach long term. And if you do, the comprehensive plan is the place to say that, or at least to put those policies out. But I wanted to lay that out for you, and I hope you read this. You didn't have much time to read these. I'm prepared to go through them tonight, but I wanted to introduce that topic first. So, and again, the last thing I wanted to point out, when I was going to skip the 2100 or the 2100 number, this 5.7, that only has a 5% probability of coming to fruition at this point. That's what the statisticians say. And Bob is right. It has a 95% chance of not happening. But when places consider risks of development and things like that, they're pretty conservative about how they deal with these types of risks. And the evidence is how we manage development in the flood zone. We allow it, but we make sure it's built well out of the flood zone elevation if we can. So it's not, no one knows for sure what that number is going to be long term, what the extent of sea level rise. We can assume if things continue to go the way they've been going in the past, the number will be higher than 2.1 feet, but we just don't know how high the number will be.
Chris, you said for the 75% chance in 2050 for the 5.7.
Yeah.
What's the probability of the 2.1 happening
It was
in 2050?
yeah, I discussed that at the last meeting. I was looking for the report. I believe it's 85% or 82%, 87, something like that.
Pretty high
That's
number.
the number that I'm having trouble grasping as to the statistical validity of that number. I've read no reports saying that is an accurate number. Statisticians can play games with any sort of number,
Right.
and I just want to know, is that number valid? And nobody has presented that saying that it is valid.
Okay. So I'll have to call the Planning Commission's attention to those reports. I did summarize it at the
I saw that
early
you
in July, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there are two sets of predictions. One was done in 2013, and then 5 years later, in 2018, a separate set was done.
Right.
We had already started on these mapping exercises before we got word from the state that they've had the new predictions. And in that second report, it shows the statistical probability of each of these events happening. I can't get beyond that. We can ask someone to come in and talk to you. I mean, I could search for the committee members and see if they can.
Yeah, I'm not saying that it's not going to happen. It could be a higher number. It could be 3.0, it could be 0.5, or it could be 2.1. And
Well, what they're
how
saying,
are we to know which is the right number?
well, the consensus, and after going through this two times of projecting,
Right.
they've centered on this number, and it hasn't deviated much. Even though there are multiple people doing they've all converged on that number, give or take.
Right.
So I feel it's good enough for government work, as they say. And it's not going to vary in a magnitude as you've thought.
Well,
Because
we
you're not providing
but we
a
don't
range
know
of-
that.
Well, they do provide a range of probability, and in that report. And the mean is 2.1, which has the highest likelihood of happening. There's on each end of that, there's a number.
Is there anybody at like Maryland planning? Because when Charlie and I went to the MML a year and a half ago, or whenever that was, they talked about what Maryland, Maryland as a state had established those numbers for planning factors that planning commission should use so they adopted that at the state level. There's probably somebody at the Maryland Planning Commission level, because I know I sat through some class with them, and they should have some more additional information. Maybe if you reach out to them, they might be able to have that information, because I know they had adopted that, and basically at that MML, they talked about that to the different communities of, hey, here's the number basically that we were required. I seem to remember them saying we were required to use, or we should at least consider that number in our future plans.
But that's what I was going to echo. That's what I remember from that meeting. They didn't, they were very clear. I mean, there's not a rule, but their recommendation coming out of the conference
be no less than
should
that.
be no less than that. Yeah.
I don't remember who all talked about it. It came up in multiple venues, I think, at the MML in 2018.
The recommendation in that report is that we use that 5.7 for planning longer term.
Right.
With the understanding that it could be higher.
Yeah.
So that's
Maybe if you can reach out to
I will.
Maryland planning and just see, maybe they can give you a little more on the statistical side of it.
So your recommendation is to consider a master plan for flooding, for risk reduction.
yes.
And so obviously that would take a little bit of time if we were to do that. The recommendation in the interim would be, what would your recommendation to be like until that plan was adopted?
Yeah, good question. Can we just go into it? Or you were.
Now, I don't know
Sure.
if anybody else had any other questions about what Chris first talked about. I'll be honest, I'll let you know, Chris, I did not have a chance to read through this
Okay.
prior to the meeting tonight, so I
So
don't have a lot of, I'm not gonna be able to tell you a whole lot. I'll read it between now and the next time we
can
get
take our
together.
time. I could.
But I
read
just know,
sentences. I could just touch on the main points.
yeah,
Just to,
touch on some main points. I won't be able to do a whole lot with it tonight,
Yeah,
and I apologize for that.
no
Just
need-
kind
no
of where
need
I'm
to
at this
apologize
month.
You got it yesterday, Mr. Chairman. It's okay. There's no way you can make it through this. Yeah, so the recommendation number 1, and that shows up on page 14. Oh, before I get there, just to preface this. The discussion starts on page 12, and the first couple paragraphs basically say the town has vulnerabilities. And in the long term, we can't pinpoint it, but we need to acknowledge it somehow. And because sea level rise is a long-term challenge, this plan adopts basic principles to guide Chesapeake Beach, even through 100 years in there, just to sort of commit to a long-term planning process on this issue. Recognizing that every 10 years, when you do your comprehensive plan, you can revisit them. If new data comes in, you say, yeah, change course, make it more restrictive. But it acknowledges that there's some basic values and principles that we want to set that will guide folks in the future. And there might be others that are added. So I started with 5 or 6 principles that seem relatively factual, not much in way of editorializing, or, but it sort of says things like the low-lying areas where Fishing Creek meets the bay is the very heart of Chesapeake Beach, encompassing the recreational assets and natural resources that have shaped the town's heritage. Continued use of this area and even redevelopment are not necessarily compatible with projections of increased flooding. In other words, the town can respond in a way that doesn't mean everything that's here goes away. Principle number 1, foundational principle. 2, the town's natural environment instructs us on how to manage rising water levels in Chesapeake Bay. The marshes absorb storm surges and hold back floodwaters. The town's remaining forest stands soak up rainwater and slow its return to lower lying areas. The town's topography outlines the basin that has always organized this estuary. And when we talked about that, it showed a map that showed what the federal government projected as the floodplain before they had detailed LIDAR data to pinpoint elevations. And it was basically this bowl that we're in tonight. It's quite natural to plan for sea level rise, understanding that it can only go so far in the center here, and it's confined by that, and it's not going to leak out everywhere. Further north, though, it's a little different because we don't have that same. Everything's flat, relatively flat. It doesn't elevate until you really go pretty far south and west. If a long-term response to a rising Chesapeake Bay can be positive and aligned with a vision of harmonizing land with water. In a coastal town built as a tourist destination, rising water levels are an asset and an opportunity to build upon the town's heritage. That, I think, is the most foundational of these principles. It's value laden. There's a normative component to that sentence, and that we need to be on board with, because you could just as easily say something completely different.
I was just saying, I'm not sure everybody would agree that rising water levels are an asset.
That
That makes me
to be.
that makes me
I'd be one of
twinge a
those
little.
people.
That makes me
I
twinge a little. I understand what
Pollyanna.
you're saying, and that it does create opportunities, but when I first hear that makes me twinge, and it seems a little, hey, great, bring on the water. It's an opportunity to increase economic opportunities and recreational opportunities. I'm not, but I understand what you're going for, but and there's probably value in recognizing that there are opportunities that we'll have to change our focus and look for opportunities where they come as the topography changes. But I'm not sure I'd say it's an asset.
I think that if you added a qualifier to that, perhaps another sentence, something to the effect that left unchecked, rising waters or left unplanned for, rising waters may not or may be a liability.
Right.
Something to that effect. So it could be it could be an asset,
Right.
but without proper planning, it may not be.
The way it's written, just
I personally would strike the tone that it's an asset in any way whatsoever. I like the phrasing of without proper planning, it's a disaster or not something to that effect.
With
but-
proper planning, it could be an asset.
I like that.
Without
phrase.
proper planning, it may be a liability.
to call sea level rise an asset is I don't know how I'll say that just doesn't sit well with me. And similarly, we're only talking about sea level rise, which is only one impact of climate change. And we can't plan for rising temperatures per se. Sea level rise is just the most tangible way that we're going to feel those effects. I definitely object. I mean, I'm only one voice, but I object to anything other than without proper planning. It would be a very negative thing. That's just my take. I won't say it again.
I have to put a few things in here to get the discussion going.
Oh, you found one.
Good. The next one gets more to the kind of facts, I guess. Lands that were made through the filling in of wetlands are the most quickly threatened by sea level rise. It's clear the maps show. Allowing space for water to reclaim these areas and for wetlands to migrate within them recreates the storage capacity for floodwaters and a buffer to storm surges. And by the 2050 projection, there are a number of areas, and we've discussed them, that will be underwater that are probably impractical to wall off, nor advisable. And that's an important thing to recognize. And so as not to suggest that even areas that are currently in the process of transitioning, we could somehow protect them with defensive structures, or we should. So this principle sort of points to a direction of response. The next one is unplanned and uncoordinated efforts to build structural defenses, including seawalls, raised bulkheads, shoreline revetments, and pier docks, etc., are counterproductive to ongoing efforts to protect public safety. Such measures must only be undertaken in a coordinated way consistent with an adopted plan. I guess the most important element of that is that the structural, higher seawalls or bulkheads and all that, the water still needs to go somewhere. And it may simply displace water onto other properties if it's not thoughtfully planned out.
So I have a question about that. What shoreline improvements are individual property owners allowed to do currently? So take the guy back, go back in this behind the wastewater treatment plant or water treatment plant, wastewater treatment plant. And, we know there's some marsh areas back there and it's encroaching on some properties. Do they go through MDE? Is that who would ultimately, in the Corps of Engineers, who would ultimately permit some sort of shoreline intervention?
It's actually, you're referring to actually construction on the shoreline.
Yeah, whether it be a living shoreline, whether it be a hard structure, or what
MDE
What are
and the Corps of
they-
Engineers have the approval authority for that.
but there's nothing that requires them to run some model of all the other existing structures. Because again, I'll go back 30 years in college, and I remember doing shoreline stuff, and one guy puts up a hard seawall, and the next guy starts getting downstream erosion because of the way he's changed the wave pattern. And so when that guy goes in to look at an individual property permit or something, is there someone who, because I like what this says, again, that unplanned individual action can cause severe effects to other areas. Is there someone that looks at that overall modeling?
If it's within navigable waters, as you know, or within open
Engineers.
waters,
Corps of
it goes to MDE and the Corps of Engineers. And I would imagine that if they find it necessary, they would require modeling of that as part of their permit
Okay.
package, certainly for larger projects. But it's right today.
That's not
how
navigable
these
water,
things-
that's not navigable
No, that is
water.
not.
That's just
That's right. Along Fishing
marshland.
Creek. Well, in marshland, it would be an MDE requirement that, but I don't know if the Corps of Engineers is involved in that. But it would be MDE, and they would make a judgment based on their,
Harmful effects of
yeah,
neighboring.
it's gonna be more like, does it lead to scouring? Is it gonna deplete this area of natural vegetation? Is it gonna affect the wildlife? Right now, there's no plan to see, no broader understanding to see, do we want the structure there? Or
Right.
will it forestall other improvements that are gonna be a lot less expensive for the town down the road? So that's what this gets at.
I guess I would quit. Is there a mechanism right now that someone has to,
There's not a mechanism.
And that's what would be part of the master plan that Chris is recommending.
I think the
We-
engineer is gonna lead a big part of this plan.
Okay.
Over
I'm just-
time.
I'm just trying to think through of, I think that's an important statement. I'm just not sure from a mechanism we have to prevent that. Prevent someone from doing
Oh, well, we don't have that now.
Right.
But we do have regulatory authority over work in the critical area.
Okay.
But our, as codes are written now, we are looking at things like
Okay.
erosion and impervious surface coverage. Our authority is really limited right now. In order to, implement this principle, new regulations would have to be adopted. The town would have to say, sure, that's fine, but we have to do it in concert with an overall plan. That's how that's why I've been making the point that I think moving forward over the next 10 years or so, we have to revamp and rethink various
Or-
critical area regulations like mitigation. Doesn't make sense when land is subsiding and water is rising. You can't do on-site mitigation because it won't last more than 20 years or 15 years. So, it needs, I think, a complete overhaul. It's not us that will do it. I think it's going to be a state, it's going to be municipalities, it's going to be counties. A lot of people are going to be working. Work is underway in the planning profession now to understand all this. And I think over the next decade, Chesapeake Beach's regulatory framework, zoning framework is going to be different in response. And I think it has to be.
Just one more question on this topic. Could you point us to or do you know of any companies that have done this in an area? Or I know probably you said, talked about this master flood risk reduction plan because probably it's been done before, I assume.
And I will say, the more I think about this, the less I'm convinced that it's simply one master plan. It's probably a decade of planning,
Right.
revisiting, updating, and funding new projects, testing. But some basic principles have to be established to guide that, or else you're just leaving it to some technocrat that will do the plan. That's what I hope you will engage with these principles to set forth the standards for future planning.
So I don't know if for anyone else, but what you just said really resonates with me, and I'm wondering if it shouldn't be explicitly stated. That part of the plan is, not to sound stupid, but part of the plan is to plan. Like there's obviously better words for it, right? But that to me would be a great thing to explicitly specify.
Probably involves some sort of a commitment from council then to understand that in order to be effective, we need some sort of financial support to do those things or grant, again, I don't know where, there's probably some untapped sources out there, but there's never enough state money to do everything you want to do. But again, I think one of the things I deal with it at work, it's that you need some sort of ongoing commitment year after year to support master plans and enact parts of it and then revisit it. And I think that was Charlie's point of by explicitly stating that, the importance of that, maybe that'll resonate of we need some sort of ongoing, we can't just fund something 1 year to take a stab at it and then put it on the shelf for 10 years. There's probably elements that need to continue to develop and evolve to really pull together a plan over a decade.
Some of this is covered in your recommendations on the following pages, so I think we should.
I should have read it. Thanks, Larry.
Yeah, we can jump into that. In answer to Lori's question, the kind of the state of the art and planning engineering on this is in the Netherlands and a number of low-lying cities in Italy. And in fact, when New York did their initial planning, they call it the Big U, is what a private initiative that had some public funding. But they've done other work like just outside New York City. I think they call it the Blue Revetment or the Blue Seawall or something. Basically, is a naturalized area, raised elevation that is allowed to flood, but it attenuates the force of flooding, and it's high enough to slow most of the storms down. And it has a built-in process to gradually elevate it and fix it as time goes on. But a lot of that work is being done by people that they're searching Europeans who've had experience with this. But there is I think an emerging specialty in this area because it really combines combines architecture, because buildings have to be designed a certain way, civil engineering, urban planning, landscape design, landscape architecture. All of those sort of design professions are engaged. Of course, there's a legal aspect to this, incredibly important. So all of that has to be intertwined. That's why it's almost impractical to say, in year 2 of this plan, we're going to do a master plan. It's going to be various iterations of it, getting down to the basics. And should someone in the private sector want to exercise their authority or rights now to develop something, then they're contributing to that plan, and they're going to be perhaps funding part of it. They will be building a project that helps implement the plan as it evolves over time. But simple comprehensive planning is not going to win the day on this issue. And simply regulating development like we do because it's in a critical area or a floodplain has no resonance on this issue, in my professional opinion. The next principle is rising water levels expand the area that is vulnerable to flooding. As the bay rises, areas that do not flood today are predicted to flood, and areas that do flood today are predicted to experience more flooding, more frequent and severe flooding events. An annual 1 in 10 chance of flooding presents an unacceptably high risk to public health and safety. It is 10 times the potential found in the officially regulated FEMA floodplain. Areas predicted to have a 1 in 10 chance of flooding by 2050 are predicted to be open water by 2100. Right? So that talks to the progression of how things go, because it's all based on elevation of the ground. If you don't build in defenses, that's what happens. And I think maybe it's self-explanatory, but I think it's worth stating the obvious for any decision makers that might think how to proceed in this.
Chris, I would add a sentence recognizing that as the waters rise, flooding will increase, but also as the bay rises, existing wetlands will tend to migrate inland from their existing location.
Yeah, it's true. Good point. Everybody okay with that? I'll add that. I think that's a good point. In fact, it's happening now up by the fire department. They're mowing wetland grasses. And it's not unusual to walk up there and you feel the lawn, which is not lawn anymore, it's spongy. Migration is happening. Of course, it's happening along Harbor Road Extended in a big way. Okay, so the recommendations. The first one talks about the master plan, but I've been talking about that for a while, so we don't have to dwell on that. So what happens, what should we do before the master plan or planning is accomplished? There are, as we mentioned, there are areas that will be below sea level by 2050. In other words, they'll be inundated by this 2.1 sea level rise.
Chris, just before you go on to recommendation 2, just wearing my lawyer's hat on recommendation 1. I always, whenever I see a list of things that could happen, I would always add, would include but not be limited to.
Yes.
So you can make that argument that all those is the universe of things that could happen.
Got it. Oh, by the way, while we're on this point, if I could just riff a little bit about this. The thinking in a lot of the urban design community, landscape design community, the professionals that are dealing with these issues, is to build in the capacity for water to flow, to create channels where that can fill up. It can be green and then they fill up with water. To build berms that are essentially elevated walkways through an area that will flood over time. So you build in this recreational park amenity as you accommodate the flood without building seawalls and blocking everything off, which would be almost impractical, I think, because you have to wrap it all around up to a higher elevation down Fish Creek and then up and down the bay to some point. So I think that's the vision that the planners who do this master plan over time will have to contend with. The alternative is to much more of a structural, to wall it off, which may have applications in certain locations, but it's probably going to be a mix of soft design and hard design. But what matters is what the comprehensive plan says about the future of this whole area, because the master planning will implement your vision for this center of town. And that's really important. And we've already shifted our development view, town center view, out of that area into more here and, which is at a slightly higher elevation and incidentally is out of those worst case flooding, certainly in the short term. So I just want to mention that this master plan for flood risk reduction is not just simply about labeling every property owner based on its risk of flooding and suggesting that their buildings be elevated when they rebuild them. It's about building in the capacity of the town to be resilient as sea levels rise. If they don't rise, well, we still have green space. We still have the capacity to have a park, and you still protected the harbor and the marina and all that. So I think we're fortunate in this particular part of town to have flexibility, because if we get it wrong on the long-term future, we haven't really compromised private development expectations. There's no development proposed there. All we've done is to build in the capacity to deal with rising sea levels in an area that's wide open anyway. Moving north, though, where the sewage treatment plant is, moving north to First Street, that area is low-lying, and I think it's probably going to be more amenable to structural changes because the people live there. I mean, all along C Street and then some of these side streets. And the fire department's there. The wastewater treatment plant, the road to it will be underwater. So that's something that the town will have to address. I just want to give you a flavor of what these plans do. And you can look on Google and just Google, risk reduction, flood risk reduction planning. You can see a lot of different options out there. You see some of the big ones like in New York and there's some European models that are really neat. But not many small towns have had to contend with this yet. They've not addressed it. Okay, so the gist of number 2 is that those areas that are expected to be underwater in 2050, and we know that they're located based on the mapping to be at the extension of Harbor Road, which is where the old rail line came in to town. We know that northern wetland that I just referred to is encroaching into the residential community there. David Street and I think it's D Street, those houses that come into that dead end right at the waters or the wetlands edge. That's going to be water's edge, and the wetlands are moving into those yards already. And most of the tidal wetland acreage throughout town, there's a lot of smaller tidal wetland acreage, like where the Coast Guard facility is. There's a number of others that are going to be under real water if these projections hold true. So these should be off limits to defenses, to sea level rise, and new development or redevelopment, and zoned for resource conservation. So that's a recommendation that at least a band of area become resource conservation to accommodate the sea level, so that we avoid the possibility of any further development within or impervious surface coverage or structures within these areas.
I've got a problem with the banning development. And that goes back to my experience in eminent domain and regulatory takings issues.
Yeah.
When you deny someone, a landowner, of the right to all practical use of the land, you have taken their property, and the town is going to be liable for the value of that property on that. So when you've got to leave value in that property somehow. So when you say you're going to ban development within an area, let me posit a situation. Let's assume that you have the owner of a lot that is currently or projected to be flooded 95% by 2050. If you say he can't develop that lot, you have taken the value of that land from him.
Right.
And the town's going to be liable for a regulatory taking for that.
And one of the ways that Chris has tried to mitigate that is the transfer development rights in the next recommendation.
Well, I know that he's got a TDR requirement or suggestion in there. So you need to be careful, or I think we have to be careful when we start talking about banning all development, that we leave value somehow in that lot.
Agree.
So
But then let's posit another situation. The county came into this problem with their TDR program when they were calculating density of the TDR generating property. They did it for the total acreage, including land that was not developed. And so how do you handle that?
right.
So if this lot is going to be 95% flooded, is there value in it now? And these are all the things that lawyers really love to get their teeth into and argue about. So,
And what
but
I would
it's
say,
it's a conundrum.
what I would encourage the town to say to lawyers in that conversation is, these are areas that are experiencing the effects of sea level rise now, which the natural conditions really limit their potential. The town is not going to extend any road to it, and the town is not going to allow you to project development off of lands that wouldn't be developable anyway. But with a resource conservation zone, you can still do a single family house. You can still do a variety of other.
But
types
you've
of
already,
uses.
but you've said you're banning development, new development.
Yeah. But I heard what you said.
Yeah.
We can't really move forward with that idea.
I mean, it's
But we're showing-
I agree. We should strike that phrase.
yeah, so what's the
Yeah.
mitigation for that in the language? Would it just be to limit or to ensure that development is in sync with the reality of coming sea level
Yeah.
rise? Would that be a better way to phrase it?
No, I'm not. I would have to think about your specific language on that. I'm just raising the issue of a regulatory taking when we take all the value of land.
Can we
Right.
say that the town will not allow the development of structures that would protect lands that are going underwater now?
Or I'm the owner of this lot that is projected to be underwater, and I'm going to say, all right, I'm going to build my house on that land on pilings, and the water's going to flow under that, and I'm going to have a causeway out to a road.
Right.
Are you going to take that right from me?
Right. But I don't think so. But what if the town said, your proposal is build a hotel, and it's allowed under current zoning, and that would require a new road and require seawalls to hold back the water, and elevating the land or something like that, our response would be,
Well, if you have an adequate public facilities ordinance, then you wouldn't have to worry about it because you never build the road. And
Well,
you
forget
never
about
have
the road.
adequate public
It's a
facility.
private driveway that's elevated. Would our response be, that's too intensive of a development proposal for that property as a matter of course? And so we are suggesting that that area be, in this plan, zoned resource conservation, which is only allows a minimum amount of development.
Yeah, if you are allowing them to have value under the resource conservation,
Yeah,
that retains value.
right.
But you can't then deny all development, all
Right.
new development. And
And is there a way to, because part of that talks about I think you hit a bunch of different things in that one sentence or two.
Yeah.
But it's I think where I struggle is the improvement that you do would cause adverse effects to the surrounding lot. And so some way you need to, it's that whole thing. If you raise your lot, you're going to create that channel and flow all, and then cause even more water to flood because it's not able to absorb it on that lot. It's going to flood the neighbor's lot more. And is that,
well, if you do
so
that,
you
then
adversely affect him or her or,
created a tortious situation where the downstream owner can sue the upstream owner for diverting water onto their property.
Would we entertain that? Because it's just, the results of that are civil. I mean, wouldn't the jurisdiction, a town
Well, I would.
try to avoid the,
Oh, absolutely. You would want to avoid the town being put into situations being a co-defendant to the upstream owner.
right?
could we be by approving that development?
Crafty lawyer would put you in.
I know. And that's,
I certainly would if I was representing the
I
downstream
would
owner.
too. And if I'm the guy suing, I'm going to go to the guy with deep pockets
Absolutely.
and it would be viewed as not the other property owner.
But I think Larry mentioned the TDR program, which I think is a really fabulous idea to introduce into the town with some caveats on it. But that could be a way of retaining value in the property to let the property owner sell off those development rights.
The reason I didn't comment on Larry's comment first, I wanted to reserve that for the next point because this set of recommendations really deals with properties that have very limited development potential now. And it would be hard to structure. I think it would be unfair to the public interest in protecting these areas to allow someone to project a development scenario off of land that is sinking and being flooded now. In other words, we wouldn't allow development under those circumstances. So to transfer land or rights off of that property that couldn't materially exist would only add to the town's build out without giving any real benefit.
As a practical matter, that won't happen because the developer won't get financing to do it. Or
It
insurance.
also seems a little bit sticky because, I mean, can't we just rezone those areas to their lowest use without providing TDRs? I mean,
Yeah, for those
as long
areas,
as they
yes,
have
I
a
think that's-
use, like we don't have to give TDRs to somebody for 10 hotel rooms because they're in a wetland, because we can preserve their right to build a single family house or some other structure. Is that right?
Yes, okay. And that's why I suggested zoning them for resource conservation. And the town zoned a lot of land for resource conservation at the following 2002 plan. So they could do that again in response to this change in conditions to avoid the potential of having to transfer rights out of areas that are flooding or to avoid the potential that someone could get a project approved. And again, these are small areas, and you can look at the map, but the larger areas, and I think the more critical areas for TDR discussion is in the next point, because it says avoid building in the annual 10% probability flood areas. And let me show you on the map so we can really hot. I just ruined my calculator. Okay. Well, here's the. Let's just skip down to something a little more. Okay, here's a map of what we've talked about as vulnerability zone 2. It's the label we've assigned to it, and there's a picture of it. You know, it's where we are today. It's that great wetland complex and maritime development and tourism development. So this map shows the edge of the predicted open water. Right, it's this line, and so it's this dark blue color. It shows, as a result of that, we project flooding on top of a higher tidal baseline, what the 1 in 10 year probability flood is. So in the areas that are lighter blue, here, 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 here around captain's quarters, there's a 1 in 10 chance of having a flood within this area or beyond it in higher elevation. So it's called an exceedance probability. So these areas, in my view, is at a high risk. I mean, I don't know what you think, but if 1 in 1% flood zone is a high risk, is a risk, certainly enough to regulate development in the way that we do there. Areas that could be flooded once, it has a 10% chance of being flooded once a year, certainly.
Or a 90% chance of not being flooded once a year.
Well, yeah, I guess you can say that, but it's frequently the case that there are multiple flood events in any given year, too. And when they track these actual statistics, they see that I think areas in the 100-year flood event flood 64% of the time, 64% of the years over like a 10-year period or 20-year period. So it's to say it's a 100-year flood event, or flood zone, or just 1% really minimizes the actual flooding that happens.
Also, just to interject there, so the flood event increases that they're predicting, are they based solely on sea level rise, or are they also based on another important factor of climate change, which is increased storm potency?
Well, yeah.
So if that's the case, then these numbers probably aren't even remotely accurate.
Well, no, this doesn't take into effect possible storms that are spun out of, higher water temperatures. If that's but it does layer onto higher water levels the effects of storm surge. And the storm surge is typically contained within that 500-year flood zone, which is the 0.2 annual exceedance probability. That's quite conceivable that floods happen more frequently in the 500-year zone as we go along, and they'll have to redraw the zone and move it into the 100-year. Right? So I think it does contain the notion of flood or a storm surge associated with hurricanes and the like.
But not the increase of storm surge based on higher potency and higher frequency of storms.
Only to the extent that the higher frequency and potency is related to higher levels of water, which is clearly the case there. But I don't know what other variables are beyond that, but just this, storms will be worse in coastal communities because the water levels are higher, and it may be worse because of other factors. But I don't know how to deal with that. So yeah, conceivably these could be very conservative ones. Um, Anyway, so here you see the Fishing Creek Marina. Areas that are around it, extending into the parking lot that's up there. Here's Kellum Field. This is a boatyard that's right behind the housing area itself, which by the way is a point D. So 1.2 feet of flooding in the 10% flood. So presumably every year you have a 10% chance of getting that flood. But in the 1% FEMA designated floodplains, 3.8 feet. So, and then the big floods, 5.7 feet. The big flood is the 500 year storm, which is regulated by FEMA. So I guess what I'm getting at is these are the areas that become high risk over time as a result of sea level rise. And recommendation 2 or 3 addresses this issue. Because of the heightened risk, the annual 1 in 10 flood probability areas will be off limits to public buildings and facilities except critical water dependent public safety installations. If the Coast Guard needed a facility, or if we have the scuba team or through the fire department. All development or redevelopment, whether public or private, will be strongly discouraged through new land use regulations. Further, structural defenses to sea level rise will be discouraged in these areas until specifically recommended in the master plan. The zoning map may be revised to classify these areas as resource conservation, and no development activities, including shoreline structures, would be allowed unless specifically recommended by the master plan by the town, the master plan adopted by the town.
We're not including that language that you discussed.
But
about
Chris, you're
no.
saying that the charter fishing pier and dock along Rod and Reel would not be allowed unless specifically recommended by a master plan adopted by the town.
Yeah, as an example.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, Chris.
Huh?
I didn't hear what you just said.
Yeah, as an example, hypothetical example. But this area, which is all privately owned, would not be, could be a resource conservation zone, which is, I think, the most protected that you can actually get to while still leaving some equity in the land. Or it could be hands-off, no zone for building structures that hold back the water until there's a plan for that. So to your point earlier, there's no individual private construction of seawalls or flood protection until the plan gets done to make sure that makes sense in this area. So that, and if you're building in this area, we have to have some architectural standards and elevation standards and grading and flood and elevations. Can you elevate your land? Can you before any major development?
Chris, when you say no development activities, then including shoreline structures to be allowed, are you including in development activities a parking lot, which is a development activity?
Yeah.
Why would you not want to allow a parking lot, which could flood over and then recede?
Well, it could simply worsen.
Well, it adds impervious surfaces, but you don't have the structural issues of a building there if you allow a parking lot.
Right. Well, I guess I'm not prepared to think through all the details right now. But I did want to call it out as a second layer of concern that we not treat those areas as business as usual, because while they will not be or not projected to be underwater, they are projected to face the brunt of the new flood flooding events. And to ignore that reality would allow development potential in that area that will make it harder to manage these effects later on. Potentially could. I don't know that for certain, but building in flood-prone areas, unregulated, typically not a wise thing to do. They're not technically within the FEMA 100-year floodplain, so they're exempt now. But maybe we ought to treat them that way, because we're moving to a point within the horizons of this plan where any major structure in those areas will be at risk.
Does that put us at risk of taking away, or do some of the key activities that happen in that zone today that people appreciate about Chesapeake Beach, i.e. we have the boat ramp that the town, I guess we don't operate it, but we had the free boat ramp access stuff this summer for the town citizens, and people boat there. There's that recreational aspect that if we say there's no development there, we shot ourselves in the foot of things of other parts of what we're trying to accomplish in the plan by enhancing the opportunity to get to the water, to have that.
I'm not suggesting here that there be no development, but no major development until
The master.
a plan for that is done, till we figure out the parameters of.
That might take us a decade.
Being said is that puts us legally at risk though. So
I'm
we
just-
wouldn't want to do that, right?
Well, I'm just thinking through I'm just playing devil's advocate, really. I mean, I'm not saying you're right or wrong. I'm just thinking through of.
That is where all the commercial activity essentially in Chesapeake
boating.
Beach happens.
Boating.
And so we're essentially saying we're going to stop any planning for additional or improvements to commercial activity until we come up with some subsequent plan, master plan, to accommodate it, is the way I read this. So if your charter fishing boat captain don't plan on staying there because it may not be in the master plan, go someplace else.
And most of that area isn't the charter boat guys, because they're further out on the channel, or they're out on the other side of the bridge where they built some seawall stuff. They're raising that. They've met some of the new FEMA guidelines and things like that. Yeah, on the eastern side of the bridge. But I'm just thinking. I don't know, I guess I'd want to think through.
I'm sorry, I just want to clarify something because I'm maybe a little bit confused. We're talking about forward-thinking new development.
Yeah.
So
But-
what's happening at Rod and Reel is moot
Yeah,
for the
no.
purposes of this discussion. And even, the
Marina.
ramp or whatever, like you said, where most of the commercial activity happens. Maybe I'm misunderstanding the area we're talking about. But if we're talking about this area,
In the back.
not much. Is that right?
Well, this area where the boat ramp is today is projected to be underwater.
And the one behind it, and
Not
the
usable in.
On the other side of the bridge, where the charter boats are moored right now, is one of the areas we're talking about.
Right, but the development there is in
Already
progress.
accounting for
Nothing
it.
we do today is going to impact the development there.
No, we're talking about planning for the future. If you're planning for the future and running a charter boat out of there, you might want to be looking for someplace else because they can't raise the parking lot until a master plan comes out. And
You can't put in a new piling until the master plan comes in. That's the way this
and I
reads.
guess and I thought
To your point,
more.
I guess I'm thinking that they've already raised the parking
So
lot.
I was
But in the
thinking that
seawall
Chris was
as part of it.
recommending.
But you're right. 20 years, if they needed to do it again, they could.
In Marina West is kind of where I was like that little leg back behind where you were pointing, Charlie, is where a lot of just regular homeowner people have power boat stuff sitting there. in those 20 some, I don't know how many slips there are. Yeah. And that in the parking associated with that leads back to the Fishing Creek boardwalk thing would be underwater before some of that commercial stuff that Larry was talking about. And that's where, again, I could see that quickly coming underwater and then not being it, and they would be prevented from improving it to keep it in operation.
I guess I'm totally misunderstanding because I thought what Chris was recommending was that we identify the area and we think about making a master plan to deal with flood control for the town. But there is an interim. And what Robert is saying is in that interim, we shouldn't prevent use because there's a legal liability. So.
Well, what the words of this are no development activities.
Right. So I agree. I
along
don't think we should
short
use those
time
words.
would be allowed. So,
Right.
I mean, that's pretty clear
Yeah.
to me.
Well, how about limited? I mean, can you just change the no to limited so it gives you some opportunity to,
Or just
do
some.
do logical? I'm still wondering why we have not hired consultants to come in here and explain to us the realities of possible flood mitigation. I mean, there are consultants all over the world dealing with this, and until we have those consultants tell us, hey, look, you could easily just trudge this area, divert water this way, and it could actually mitigate enough so we don't have to have the no development zones, the no, the no planning zones. I think we're doing this without the knowledge that we need to go forward. We don't have the consultants that we should be having here to.
But
But don't
To
we
go
need
through
the
this.
comprehensive plan to get the consultants?
We do. I think that,
We have
Yeah,
to get
and
to that
so
point, but I'm just saying, aren't we going ahead of ourselves and putting the cart in front of the horse?
I think it's laying out the vision where we have to go. And then I'll be honest. And I think maybe you then have the information, the tools you needed the next time the comprehensive plan is revised to take that to take a stronger action. I'm just concerned in this window that maybe we won't see any flooding happen over, we may not see it where some of that becomes unavailable, but I guess
But we can't.
the way
change
that's
it,
written, it
which I agree.
is
We
a
can't
little
change it.
strong to me. I think that comprehensive plan as it relates to flooding risk mitigation stuff is really important and great, but that doesn't happen overnight. And we would never get a thorough enough study done in time to influence this comprehensive plan
I agree
in a
with
broad
that.
spectrum. And I think it's a combination, and maybe we have to work on that specific language in that part. I think you're hearing some of our concerns, and maybe when you go back and work on this again, think about how we might
My thinking
soften that.
was that to come up with some action item or policy about how to deal with those areas, thinking that they're at a higher risk than any other part.
Yeah.
And what should we say about them, if anything? That's kind of what I'm struggling with here. And I don't want to throw the whole kitchen sink at it. I just, maybe it's just the acknowledgement that they're higher risk and we need to come up with solutions. And we need to forestall major private projects that would make it more difficult to build the defenses.
Or they get a higher intensity level of review in that zone. Maybe their consultant, when they put together the proposal, have to come in and talk, and maybe traffic management plans and things like that, where I'm gonna dealing with at work, where I'm introducing a larger number of vehicles into a zone, and we have to talk. We have the burden to prove that we're not negatively going to impact all of those around us, and maybe speaking to some sort of a higher level of review of their project to where they speak to some of that, or they spend a little time in this interim until we get some of this comprehensive plan stuff done. Maybe that's a way we could deal with it.
It seems to me we need to be more positive and not scare off investment Because just the statements that we're going to put,
Pretty strong.
not be allowed, that they aren't going to be able to get money to do it. So there's no sense, they won't even come to us. We'll never know. Identifying it as a potential that we recognize and that we're concerned and going to work on ways to mitigate or making
Informed decisions.
informed decisions, I think is probably enough to scare off any investors, and we won't see any money anyway. So I don't think we need to be quite as strong as this language.
Chris, let me ask you a process question. We're working on a comprehensive plan. From that, we develop a zoning ordinance. From that, we develop a master plan to deal with floodwater mitigation issues. Zoning ordinance and the master plan have to comply with the structure, what we put into the master plan or the comprehensive plan. So what we put in here dictates the parameters, the outer parameters of what these various subsidiary ordinances are going to do. So if we say, I don't know if you have it in here, saying we're not going to allow another house. The comprehensive plan says no development of any new buildings at all in Chesapeake Beach. Both the ordinance and the master plan cannot then allow that, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Right. So if we say in here, in the comprehensive plan, no new development to be allowed in whatever we call these blue regions, the master plan cannot now come back in and say, all right, you can develop under certain conditions.
Oh, no, the master plan can say anything it wants because it would be adopted as an amendment or refinement of the comprehensive plan. And
You would have to amend the comprehensive plan to do that. The
Yeah.
master plan can't amend the comprehensive plan.
Well,
It's like a statute can't amend the Constitution.
but if it's adopted as an amendment to the plan, it can be adopted as an amendment to the plan. So if it's clear that what's being changed, because it's actually part and parcel of the comprehensive plan, it's just a supplement to it, or it's not a separate document. As I was careful thinking through that, and I said it would be adopted as the comprehensive plan, as an amendment to the comprehensive
Appendix to it.
the detailing of these recommendations. And it's true, some of the recommendations may diverge from what's here, but they become comprehensive. They become the comprehensive plan because it's adopted as an amendment to it.
On the flip side of what Bob said, if the comprehensive plan says these are areas of concern, the master plan could come back and say there'll be no building in this area because it was an area of concern. You could go the other way too.
Right.
So
Maybe is it as simple as striking? So I get the concern, right? I get it. I respect it. Is it as simple as striking the additional descriptors and simply saying should be designated resource conservation? At which point that definition becomes a function of how that's defined in the statutes and the master plan.
As long as resource conservation doesn't say no building.
Right, but don't we have?
Resource conservation, as it currently stated in the zoning ordinance, is a very restrictive zone that allows building. You could build a house there. That's it. Or you could build certain educational, institutional type of uses, but it would not square with the typical development vision that property
So
owners.
would
The
that-
comprehensive plan does not create zoning designations. That is done in the zoning ordinance. So the comprehensive plan, as I understand them, does not say the Calmus Marina will be resource conservation. Comprehensive plan doesn't say that. The zoning ordinance says that.
Zoning maps that
Right.
go with the zoning
It could
ordinance.
say-
we're recommending
it. It could say
You're
we
saying
intend
that-
that this be resource conservation, and then the next step is to update the zoning ordinance or change the zoning map, and
Right.
boom, it's there. And that's, I typically like to write these things with fairly clear direction Um, but if it's forestalling other viable opportunities that might come to our knowledge as we get into this more, then we shouldn't necessarily do that. Part of my writing this was what informed the sort of level of detail here was when the Planning Commission talked about those parcels on the northern end, and that they should be resource conservation, and that that commercial property should be resource conservation. I was thinking the consensus of the group was to think fairly strict about these, and we hadn't even talked about the extent to which they're going to flood. We were just talking about now they're in the blue area. So I took it fairly far in this. But now we're discussing it. We're seeing how we got to navigate this path in a very intelligent way that allows flexibility.
Let me ask a timing question. How important is it that we get a draft done tonight or our next meeting or the following meeting?
I think we have some time.
Yeah.
To noodle through this and
Yeah.
I think the discussion's good tonight. I don't expect we're going to solve this tonight, and I think we should take what we're hearing tonight and maybe each of us can think through maybe some other ways we might want to rework some of these sections and maybe give, again, throw some ideas down and shoot them back in the Dropbox to Chris and let them see what some of those suggestions, edits, concerns might be, because I think again, the discussion's good tonight, but we're not going to solve this tonight, and I don't think we have to solve this tonight from a schedule and a process perspective of where we need to be on the comprehensive plan progression.
We've been given as much time as it takes, and actually, I think the administration through Holly would like us to take time to really develop these ideas and to the fullest extent we feel comfortable with, and go to the public and take time not to get this through. So I'm taken a lot of time to update these new maps. I think they improve things. We didn't have to do it, but I think it informs where we're headed. And so we're not rushing.
Did we answer your question?
Yeah, I was
Okay.
just wondering,
Okay.
what is there a pressure on us tonight to do something?
There's
It
not.
was where my thought process
But
was
still,
going.
can I still draw your attention to the fundamental question? These areas that that are predicted to be at high risk of flooding in any given year, on account of sea level rise in the short term, which I mean 2050. Do they warrant being called out specifically as areas of concern to be addressed? Let's not talk about how it gets addressed, but what this does is focus on certain areas within this whole sea level rise construct as being worthy of deeper concern. So is there just consensus that we need to focus to call those out? If there's not, that's fine, but that would just help me if this is worth calling attention to as an area of concern or areas of concern.
My opinion is that this is as important to call out attention to this as it is to call out attention to sensitive forest areas or any other sensitive area or a town center, because they all have important characteristics that we have to address.
I would echo that. I mean, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg challenge for some of these areas because Larry, your notion of what's at the rod and reel currently is sort of interesting, and I hadn't really thought of it that way. But if you flip that around and talk about should we develop a town center, which we would certainly expect to last more than 30 years, in one of these areas, the answer would be absolutely not, in my opinion, because it wouldn't make any sense. So this has been a very illuminating discussion to think about this chicken and egg question about what's there now versus what we might want to put there. And it's different for all these areas.
Yeah, I just think the most important part is, like Robert said, is that we don't create a liability where the town would be liable to pay somebody for the property, and then also that the town wouldn't be liable for what they allowed, or the town wouldn't be responsible for infrastructure to support somebody who chose to build there. So whatever balance we can strike on those two things.
Yeah, that's good. Those are both good points, but they're conflicting points.
Right, and
You-
that's
you
what I
know what I
mean.
mean?
Whatever
Yeah.
balance we can strike on those two ideas is
Yeah, you're
what we
absolutely
should
right.
try to achieve in the comprehensive plan.
I do think it's important to call attention to those areas, though. I'm not quite sure I'm struggling with that balance of how we do that, but I think it's like Robert said, I think it would be short-sighted on us not to call attention to those areas when we know this is a big area of concern, and it's something we know we have to deal with as a coastal community. And so to just turn a blind eye to it and pretend like it's not important at all would be wrong. But to be so restrictive that I'm struggling with how to work through that. And that's why I got to spend some time reading that.
I don't want to prolong this if folks are ready to move on, but I just want to throw out one other thought that just occurred to me is there's no rule that says we have to deal with all of the areas in this designation the same way. Would that be correct?
Yeah, we're not drawing zoning boundaries necessarily. Yeah.
So we could say
Comprehensive
that
plan, we could-
that, yeah, if we look at this map and we identify, look, these areas are under high risk, but they're already commercially used and we want to minimize the impact of that commercial value. We might do something different around Fishing Creek than we might do in another part of town where there is no development, and what we really want is no new development there. And that could be part of the balance.
Right. And I
that
think
we're
that's
talking
where
about. It doesn't all have to be one category.
figure out that language that fits the comprehensive plan piece and then allows us the room to craft a good zoning ordinance to go along with that. And I think that's where I think these two gentlemen were all, just figuring out the mechanics of how that happens. We need some room to work within the comprehensive plan to not tie our hands when we go to maybe create some variance among those areas when we get to the zoning side of things, whatever year that happens.
So the last recommendation here, well, there's two more, but the second to the last one is to say that, sorry.
Many maps.
Yeah, I can't, without my glasses, can't differentiate. It's not very clear, but maybe I'll just turn the lights off. So this is one of the maps that is on the Dropbox. The dark blue areas are here, open water in 2100. And then there's the flood zones, both the high risk and the low risk, all shown in various shades of blue on this map. What the last section says is that this kind of to make it clear is that anything that's blue on this map, because it's possibly open water or because it's possible floodplain, would be eligible to participate in as sending areas in a TDR program. So those that are most at risk of flooding could be compulsory. That in order to realize your development rights at the highest point, you have to participate in a TDR program. You can develop at a certain level, but the development as max is really shipping the rights to someone else to receiving it. So all the properties that we talked about in the more short term, these 10% flood areas, to be a little more detailed, these 10% areas that are nice blue there um, rather than building in those areas, the rights could be transferred to other properties that are out of the flood zone, that are not impacted by sea level rise or higher land. And then they remain open, perhaps they're deed restricted or conservation areas that become part of the response to long-term sea level rise, whatever the case may be. And this would also include those areas we talked about in the north side of town as well. So and then I inserted a document that I've written before that I will customize for the town that defines how TDRs work. So that gets the recommendation that we've discussed before to incorporate a TDR program to try to shift development rights out of the higher risk community sections of the town. That means that in those areas that are out of the flood zone, the plan has to recommend development. Otherwise, there's no and
You have to have receiving areas.
There's no receiving. You don't get the development out of the flood protected areas. So this is a market-based kind of solution that really requires both sending areas where we're willing and encouraging of development and receiving areas where we're discouraging development.
The county is involved in or has been involved in the process where the county buys, purchase and retire TDRs. Should the town consider that? So that if you create all these sending areas and the town wants to decrease density, the town could buy the TDRs to prevent that.
Why would we increase density to decrease density? That doesn't make any sense.
A TDR program shifts density, but if
Right.
the town buys a TDR and retires it, the density that TDR is associated with goes away.
Right, I understand that, but we could just decrease the density without buying the density back.
But then you run the risk of
Well, if
taking the value away from the property, right?
there has to be a sufficient, if you're talking purely TDRs, there has to be a sufficient market or sufficient receiving area to handle the generation of the TDRs. If you're talking about outside of the TDR program, that we as a body says we want to have a flat growth rate, no increase in density in the town, or a decrease in growth rate, that we have less density, that's a whole different discussion. But we had talked earlier about, this was before you were on the board, on the planning commission, that we were going with the slow growth process, which was an increasing of a density of, what was it, 2%, 2.5%?
Yeah,
Something like
increase, which reduces the growth in the town.
Right.
But still allows some development to take place, because a lot of that development is baked in already as being infill or being existing projects. Anyway, so yeah, this is about shifting the location of development potential, not promoting new development.
I mean, to me, that's a fundamental part of the solution to the problem that you've raised about taking value from the property. And when you look at these maps, I mean, if I'm a developer and I'm looking at this map and my property is underwater, I'm all over that TDR as an opportunity, right? That's a huge opportunity for me.
It's
If
incentive to act sooner too, which allows the town more opportunity to build defenses or create this open space.
Yeah.
But as we pointed out there, Chesapeake Beach is pretty well spoken for. There isn't a lot of space to develop. So there isn't a lot, and unless there are restrictions on the density in what can be developed, then TDRs don't have much value.
Right. And so there will likely be restrictions on development in the receiving areas unless you purchase development rights.
Right.
In order to develop higher, you're conserving land elsewhere.
You could still have some restrictions.
Yeah.
On a development that happens in whatever's receiving area you're talking about. It's not unrestricted.
Oh, if it's unrestricted, the TDR is meaningless. If the receiving area has unrestricted development, then why would you need a TDR? I mean,
Right. It needs
And I think I meant if you were allowed to if you were upzoning, if the receiving area had some amount of, it's a fixed
Natural density.
It's a fixed density right now per the zoning ordinance. That TDR would allow some increase in that receiving zone, but not unrestricted.
I
It would
just
still
view-
govern what that zone looks like.
You can do it. You can do it in multiple ways. The key is to get the market mechanism right. It may be that, and this is what Calvert County did, is that areas that are receiving areas, their development prospects were lowered. And in order to get them back to where they are now or to a little higher, you had to buy development rights. And that created the market. And of course, with the purchase development program, that established the baseline and the price, and that helped
Yeah.
facilitate these transactions. And it also helped the county, essentially reduce its overall build out.
Right.
Because it was a participant. It created farmland through this program, or permanent farmland, I should say. So I don't know that the details of this get worked out by a planning commission at this level, but I think it's an important tool that has real potential to shift development. And I don't know the extent of that potential. It may be only on the margin, but there's not a lot in the scheme of things of towns, area of the town that's really threatened that it could be developed. And on the other side, there's not a lot of land that can actually be redeveloped at a higher density. And a lot of the code is written now allows quite a bit of density already. I mean, remember the project that came in a couple years ago that came to the planning commission? It was almost approved.
Dude, I was
What's the name of
sitting out there.
that? Okay, you weren't.
I wasn't on the planning commission.
Sunrise on the Chesapeake Bay. which
Oh,
is a-
that's the one that was next to your house.
Yeah, but I was out. I wasn't a planning and zoning member at the time. I was a concerned
So
citizen.
that's a 12-unit condominium building or apartment building or something. Well, that's the level of development potential that exists in the community now.
But
And-
right now, right, we can undo that.
And
Like,
what what this plan says is we are undoing it. It's saying that the recommendation is that these areas be in fact single-family neighborhoods. Maybe an accessory apartment with it, but be single-family neighborhoods, not multi-family neighborhoods. That's the key distinction I really want to reinforce, that this plan is curtailing development potential in Chesapeake Beach for the long term, as it's evolving right now. It's a draft form, of course. But so where you would have development potential that might drive a TER program, would it be have to be areas where you wouldn't reduce the potential? So for instance, like you would elsewhere. So like along Cox Road and 260, that area where the townhouses are being developed already, there's quite a bit of single family development around it. I'd get proposals for or questions about developing, how to consolidate parcels to develop higher density. So that is a marketable, developable area, which I think could drive the preservation of land that could be impacted by these sea level rise without increasing the net household in this community, which is the type of thinking that we need to work on and get settled. Not now, but we need to leave the flexibility for the town council to come up with these ideas. Again, that's not saying that this is a high growth or high density. It doesn't do that. It simply allows flexibility, shifting development where it shouldn't be, or where we're thinking it's not best to happen, to areas that can be adequately served by road systems, sidewalks, and all the other things that are needed about the town, and won't flood ever.
Right. I mean, that's a key thing.
so I know we're trying to wrap this up, but for next time, can we talk about phasing? Like, I've read a couple. I still think that this plan is very high growth, so I wouldn't want a lot of zoning that would allow for a lot of big buildings, apartments, more people, etc., to be implemented the day after we pass this comprehensive plan. And so I wonder if we might talk about phasing, if we are determined to think about those things, if we might talk about when and what conditions might phase them in, because we have a school coming, we have a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built. We have a lot of projects that aren't done that we need to assess. And so I wonder if the comprehensive plan, I have read that this is sometimes part of a comprehensive plan. How might the comprehensive plan address phasing?
Sure. I mean, we can have a discussion. I'll be honest. I mean, my personal feeling is I don't think if we were, again, not that we are, this is, I don't want anybody watching to think, if we were to adopt the comprehensive plan in October, which is not going to happen, but if we had a comprehensive plan, town council signed off on it, everything got blessed, it had been through everything, you would not see developers just flooding down the street change in a drastic change, because it all takes individual landowners to part.
Because changes of the comprehensive plan are not implemented until you enact enabling legislation such as the zoning ordinance, which comes later. So once you adopt the comprehensive plan, there is a period of time that the zoning ordinance will have to be rewritten to reflect the goals of the comprehensive plan.
And
I have a huge amount of respect for my colleague. I don't even remotely see this plan as high growth. I think that I understand that you do. I personally do not. And so I say that to emphasize that I think we need a consensus on what the definition of our plan does in terms of growth in advance of a discussion about phasing or other ways to manage the growth that our plan may promote. So I don't know how to do that. High growth, low growth are subjective terms, because one person's high could, 1% could be high for some and low for others. So I think it may be better if we try to start to phrase that in terms of potential numbers as percentages, however it can best be done, and use that as a guideline rather than subjective terms like high, low, medium.
We had that information prior to going into the meetings with the citizens over here at the community center. What was that, 6 months ago, 8 months ago? And where we were talking about the various percentage growths on there and getting the input from the community as to what they wanted on that. And the community, as I recall, and my memory may be faulty, was that the consensus of the community and of this commission, of this committee, was that we were going with the low growth, and there were numbers associated with that were presented at that, showing what the build outs would be under all these different scenarios. So we have that someplace.
Is that in Dropbox, anybody?
It might be in the Dropbox, but early on document in the Dropbox.
Public workshop notes. That sounds promising.
I have the
Image
survey on my
471,
phone.
that's not helpful.
Wasn't the survey. This was prior to the survey.
You'll find it in the document that's called chapters 1, 2, and 3. And the third chapter is the municipal growth element, which is required by state law that we deal with growth.
But you have specific numbers in there.
Yeah.
And what I'm curious as to how they map to the images, what we had on those whiteboards at the meeting. I'm bringing them up now. I have all the notes I'm seeing in here, but nowhere do I see like a range, 1% is considered low, 2 to 4 is considered medium. I don't see those anywhere. So I wish we had that.
I can say is that, I don't have it with me now, but the forecast that this plan is aiming to achieve is marginally higher than what is likely to happen anyway. That most of the growth is set up to happen anyway. Most of it's already planned, and the houses are being built now. There's a marginal increase to that, and it's far lower than any decade of growth in Chesapeake Beach's history for the next 20 years. And that's what the plan says. And these proposals you're talking about would effectively limit development well beyond 20 years, unless the new comprehensive plan opens the book again to allow more development. And I don't think you can look at that in any way other than to say this is slow and restricted growth, as the survey question pointed to.
I don't think as a practical matter, people are going to look at that. We're proposing high volume housing all along 260. Nobody will look at that and feel like they were heard when they said we want slow growth.
I disagree with that. I've tried to communicate that multiple times. I don't think, and I wouldn't want the public to think that we're proposing high volume growth. We showed the housing types. We went through all types of housing types, and it was feasible.
And the public comments were not for that.
I think there's a difference between a 2-story on top of some mixed use stuff as compared to 5-stories, big apartment complexes, which are allowed by current zoning stuff in a lot of these neighborhoods over here.
But we can eliminate that with this zoning ordinance without allowing more.
Numbers.
Oh, okay, cool. I'm actually looking at chapter 2, which has, chapter 3, the municipal growth, because the numbers, your numbers are in here. So I'm
Yeah,
trying to.
I think we should have a discussion about this, and I think we need to have a consensus move, at least a general cooperative assessment, because as long as there's division, I can't finish this plan.
Yeah.
This is foundational. Of course, we're preparing a draft. We're going to take
Right.
it to the public, but we're discussing the difference of terms. And I'm not been persuasive in addressing this, but I've laid out that there are a lot of objectives that the community wants, and not just a regression on growth, to go to negative growth. So I would only ask the planning commission members yourselves to come to some type of way to handle this, and I'll step aside until you do, because I need direction. If Lori's going to press this all the time, it slows down what we're doing. I've multiple times have gone to do that vision that I promised of showing the how it might look, but I can't invest the time or resources in doing those things as long as we're arguing over minor percentages in growth.
I think to support Lori on this, I've been getting a lot of feedback and comments from residents. I'm looking at property in Chesapeake Beach to purchase, and the real estate agents and other people involved are all talking. Well, first of all, they're very unhappy with the parking structure down here. But on top of that, they bring up the idea that they're worried. They don't have confidence in this body. They've lost confidence in this body and the town council because they think that we're from other areas coming in to just run amok on development. And if we start allowing 3, 4, 5-story buildings along, 260, this is what they're concerned about. And I think whenever you have multiple levels of multi-use, there is the potential that you could have intensity in areas that right now we see as a very low intense area. So I think that's, I'm getting that feedback a lot all the time. I mean, I'm talking to all my neighbors and other people, and that's the only feedback I get. So I understand her concern. I have concerns too. I moved here because I wanted a low intense area. The question is, when you go to the housing section and you see the multi-level number 8 mid-rise minor, and you can put that along 260, will it, in the worst case scenario, and everybody just bought up that entire block, could we just have a corridor of, of 4-story, 5-story buildings there? That's a possibility. And then you've made the area. Well, you want to look at the potential of what could happen if just development has run amok. And I've seen it in other areas. I know it's possible if this hotel goes like I think it's going to go, and everybody wants to build around it, we could have an issue with intent, and especially when we've only got this one egress, and from getting in and out of this neighborhood, it's going to be. We haven't looked at other ways to get into the town. So if we overbuild or over-intensify, we're gonna be sorry down the road. So I understand her concern, and it concerns me at times too. I thought in our planning we did allow for some diversity that would keep it low, but I know
Take
that
it up,
Lori
yeah.
coming on, and of course, again, I'm getting more feedback once we've got that parking lot on. I'm getting a lot more feedback now because now people are really concerned that we're just going to keep going on like overbuilding. So, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I don't want to interrupt you, but I just, again, with all due respect to all of what you just said, this body can't be held accountable for what the development, good or bad. It's not us
Wow.
that can be held accountable for what is being built there. And in fact, even if it was us sitting on this board, we would not have had control beyond some of the conditions we got around the artwork. And so I shouldn't even say we, because that was what was allowable under zoning as it was
As it exists
at the
today.
time.
Which
As
is
it exists
why it's
today.
As it
important
exists today.
to be
So-
careful zoning right now.
No, I
That's
totally
why
get
she's
that, but I'm
really-
just saying that if people are complaining about the parking garage and have lost faith in this body, that's a public relations problem. It's not a problem that gets to the heart of what the words are
Right,
in
it's
our
a
drafts of the
perceived-
comprehensive plan.
And that's
I
the
think
commercial
important.
area. Would they have, if we had tried to put that into their residential area? I mean, if you don't, again, we could be no commercial development and no residential development, and no one's going to be happy with the amount of services the town can afford to provide to the residents, and you'll have tax rates that are outlandish, and nobody's.
I'm not saying we shouldn't have done it or whatever. I'm just telling you what the feedback has been
No,
since we
oh,
built it.
I
And
hear
you
it
probably
all
are
the
getting
time.
the feedback as
I
well,
hear
but
it.
I just understand Lori's concern, and I just think, conversation on this is not to be ignored. I think we need to get to the heart of this and maybe republicize. I think we've lost interest. We've lost people's interest, and they haven't come to the meetings to help go over this with us. But I think we need to publicize. Again, I don't think we're getting enough feedback from citizens. That's what I think. I don't think we've done a good enough job to try and encourage enough feedback. And for me to have to go shopping and hear about it and go and do other things, we shouldn't have to be that sloppy in our approach in trying to get feedback. But I can just say that we need to get another town meeting with people back in here. I mean, the last comprehensive plan I've done, we actually mailed to every person a survey, and we actually had to come to several, like 3 or 4 different meetings. I mean, it was intense because we wanted to make sure that what we were doing went along with what the citizens wanted here. And again, I think they've lost confidence in what we think. I really do. So going back to Lori's idea, I think we really need to have another discussion on this. On the level of intensity, and yes, it may be considered slow growth, but when you look at the map and you look at the type of buildings that is possible, it looks like you could have much higher intensity, especially along 260, and that's the area that people really don't want it intense. That's my thought. But
But you said they don't want it down here either.
Well,
So I just don't.
what-
I'm trying to
what
understand.
says we have to allow more houses at all? I mean, what is the big rule that says we need to allow more residents? We're already building, and Chris's own
State law
numbers
requires
say
that you
it will
have
achieve
plans to
slow.
allow growth and development so that people have houses. That's the policy of the state. You can't shut off. You have to take your fair share of this regional growth. The county has a policy that the town will accept growth and development, the town participates in the funding, operation of wastewater. The county, the wastewater treatment plant. It's building the school. It's sized the school appropriately, which caps growth and development in the town. There's a whole gamut of policies that support a level of growth and regeneration in property values, which are critical to sustain a community. And we did have a discussion about what that looks like. And I thought we did take away some of those ideas of taller structures in here, and that we talked about and so this is draft, we're working on draft, but we're talking about like 1 or 2 levels above commercial in those designated areas, and that we even step it down further. So this is 1 level in the lower part of town, 261, so I think we're headed in the direction. I think you were influential really in that discussion early on. Laura,
I will say one thing, and I don't know if this is relevant or not, but before we started the project down here at Rod and Reel, the real estate was cool. When you have ratings, it was a cool real estate market. It is now turned hot all of a sudden. And it's like, okay, we're going into recession, but yet the real estate market is actually turning much hotter and more vibrant. So does that new parking structure indicate to the public that, hey, maybe there's more confidence in this town and there's more of a spirit of potential in this? I mean, I feel that way myself.
I think you're just seeing it all over.
I think it is true. And but I think we need to have the townspeople come in here and talk about that and discuss that, because I think doing this in an empty room is it's a tough way to go and sell this. I really think we need to encourage more interaction from the public.
I just want to point out what's on page 19. This is what you were looking at. So there is only one possible building here that could be 4 stories. Every other building is either 2 or 3 stories on 260. And on 261, it's residential above commercial, which I'm guessing is maximum 3 stories. And that's a proposal for about a 3-block stretch coming into town, which right now are empty, uncared for lots that are not attractive to someone who's driving into this town looking to buy a house in terms of a real estate market.
Yeah.
I mean, again, I don't want to get into subjective or objective terms about growth, but that isn't even growth to me. It's revitalization. So that's just my opinion.
No,
I'm very comfortable with this plan that as it stands, this draft as it stands right now. That's my take.
And we even got
Like
that
to-
letter on the email. We just received that letter of one of the citizens very upset about the direction we're taking. Now, I agree. I think that in order to revitalize, you need to have a certain level of development. So I agree there. But again, we've got either a market, either we are not communicating to the people, or the people aren't understanding, or they don't agree with us. I mean, one way or the other, we're getting a lot of feedback that is against what we're proposing.
I'd like
I
to
don't
put
know,
in
maybe
my
you are too, I
2
don't know.
cents worth on this discussion. The way I look at this is that when you're looking at changing the comprehensive plan and the zoning ordinance, you have to look at what is currently allowable development absent any change on a null scenario. And then you have to look at, all right, what are we going to do in these alternatives? Is that better or worse? One of the things that we have to look at is if we want to preserve the areas that are at high risk of flooding, we have to move that density somewhere. And where are we going to move it to? That's a value decision that we have to make. Now, what it looks like when we do it, do we move it into the top of the hill over here? Do we move it up on Cox Road, wherever? Those are value decisions. But you have to look, the way I look at it is are we changing anything from the current situation to a future situation on that? Do we want growth or not? You can debate that until the sun goes down, whether you want growth or not. I personally think that if you have a no growth scenario or a reduced growth scenario, you're killing the town. The town's going to die. You have to have commercial development or the town's going to die. That commercial development is where the tax revenue comes from. Residential development does not support itself. So we have to look at commercial development in the town. But you also have to look at the density. Are we increasing density or not increasing density? When you want to preserve the land, you've got to move that density someplace. So do we move it into a controlled area? Is where I think we have to decide where do we want to increase the density.
I just still disagree with the premise that you have to actually put the density somewhere else.
Well, if I own a lot that is going to flood, and you now say I can't build there, you've taken my land, so the town's going to pay for it unless you
don't-
give
you're
me
not on the
value in
land
that
yet If
land.
you're not built yet.
But I have that potential. I have that land. If you say I can't do anything with my property, you've taken all the value from it.
I'm not saying that you can't do anything with your property. I'm saying you can't build a hotel or maybe you can build a hotel. I don't know.
I'm not.
You
I'm
can't
talking
build an
about.
apartment
I'm talking
complex.
about a single lot that I own
Right.
that's going to be in the flood
I
area.
agree with that part of what you said.
Okay, so
We
you have to
can't
move that
swipe-
density. You have to move that density somewhere.
No, you don't have to move the density somewhere. You have to allow something to go on that property, but you don't have to allow 10 residential units to go on that property.
I'm not
You
saying
can
it.
allow
Nobody's
one.
saying that we're
And
putting.
you don't
10
have to put the other 9 anywhere.
I think the one thing that maybe Lori is also maybe needing is having things quantified. Like how many people would be using these roads if we had things built out, and if, let's say, we had a major event at the hotel, can we all get through on 261 if we've got, a huge concert going on, we've got, everything built out, so I mean, I think we have to. There was a sentence you were going to put in here about not overbuilding, let's see how to go. Something about not building over the abilities for the infrastructure to handle the something like that. Because I think we have to remember that we've only got this one road, and so the infrastructure is not going to handle too much more development. Because as far as I'm concerned, on a Friday afternoon, and if we've got this hotel using all their facilities all at one time, we're going to have some serious issues on a weekend and in the summertime. We haven't even opened that up. So I think when we project down the road, we have to look at these roads and see how we're going to be able to handle the intensity that we're looking at here. So yes, I want some growth. I mean, obviously we're going to have a little growth, but how much we were talking last time, Chris, about what kind of businesses do we need here? How much more commercial do we need? I'm pretty happy with how much commercial we have. I don't know that we need much more commercial. We could certainly use some more, maybe restaurants or but that's what I'm wondering is, what is the town council thinking? What are some of the other people thinking about how much do we need as far as commercial? We should be getting a lot of revenue from what we already have here. I don't know the numbers on that, but I just don't, everybody keeps saying, oh, we got to have more growth in commercial. Do we? I mean, I'm pretty happy. I use that Rollins Plaza constantly. I'm using all of these facilities all the time, and I'm pretty happy because most of the things that I want to buy, I'm ordering online, and that's going to get even, So I'm just.
What would you, if that's the case, what would you do? No, that's a valid point, right? There's enough here. Like, I can't point my finger at something and say, we need one of these that we don't have.
And if it's not yours,
But
then
what-
North Beach.
But what would you do then with the empty buildings on 260? Would you say the town should buy them and turn them into green space?
The town doesn't want to buy it. We're not buying it.
I'm just
But
saying, what would
that's
you
a
do?
I just want to
That's
make
a good
sure that
point. We
I
can't even
think-
run out what we have. So,
Right.
and
I
that's
think we
always been the
should
case.
try
And
major
plus-
infrastructure recreation programs.
it's got to be supported by, somebody's got to come in and think that's a viable business.
Right, and if
And no one-
we had
no one
foot
is.
traffic on bike paths and other things, then it might become a viable business. I mean, if you read about some of this stuff, this is a strategy for small towns that have no growth and nobody even wants to live there anyways. This is how they revitalize. They create their recreation assets and they market their destination, and then their businesses begin to flourish. And I think this is the safest approach that we can take right now.
That's a great idea. It's totally unrelated to how we try to infill areas of town that currently have, nothing there. And when we're trying to transfer density or deal with the issues around flooding and how we mitigate that, it makes sense to allow what growth we need to be in sensible areas. That's all this plan's doing.
I think the argument is about how much growth we need in my perspective. And I would be counteracted by that if the public, like Cynthia said, came in resounding numbers and said, yes, we want this, but they're not. And actually, we don't even know. They could be. We don't know. I don't feel like we know. Only survey that I have a record of is the one that, people voted for with the town, and it says slow growth. And then, if you took the slow growth or stopped, it much exceeds moderate or rapid growth.
But the plan is slow growth. I mean, based on this, I don't know, this is what you sent me, Bob. If I'm reading this right, and again, the term slow or rapid isn't on here, but the most recent 20-year growth rate has been 3.2%, and our plan is for 2 point something. Chris, is that right?
I honestly can't remember. I was looking for my chapter. I can't remember that.
I have your chapter up, but I don't see a specific percentage. I've been able to find a specific percentage number in it. So what
I
number,
read
is there a
somewhere.
number that you would be happy with?
I would be happy with not developing high capacity buildings within town.
But is there
I
a
don't
number
think
that you
we
would be
need
happy
that.
with in terms of percentage of growth?
Perhaps we should look at what our infrastructure is. How many cars can this particular road handle? That's one thing we have to look at, and we
Yes.
don't even know that really. And especially if we have a high use going on at that hotel or at Abner's or any of these other, they're becoming very popular. And by seeing the traffic already at the hotel, I can imagine if they have a huge, down at Solomon's when the Marine Museum, when the Marine Museum has like Earth, Wind, and Fire, you can't even drive near the place. I can't even imagine with one road how we're going to handle like Earth, Wind, and Fire or somebody like that here at the hotel. It's going to be.
They had concerts there all summer. I mean,
But
it's not
they
like
were not like Earth, Wind, and Fire. They weren't like a big name. They were.
But
They were
their
names.
new, I mean, none of their new structures. It's not like it's a bigger auditorium that's going to house Earth, Wind, and Fire. It's still their they're building additional hotel space. But it's not some new amphitheater that's going to hold 10,000 people for a show.
they're
So I'm just not-
We
They're gonna
don't
have-
know because we haven't seen.
they're going to have
it.
those
It's
little
not done.
shops and whatnot. And I'm not.
the plan showed what they were going to build.
We should bring out that plan and discuss it and bring in this traffic study that was required that the planning commission approved that dealt with these.
I mean, that light,
traffic.
that light doesn't back up near as much as it used to now that the bridge is open.
Yes, but
And
that
it's not
parking
even
lot's not
finished
being
yet
used
because
yet.
they're going to reconfigure that intersection to allow traffic to flow. But I think these are valid questions. We need to spend some time on.
Yeah, I just
We have
think
the
we
time.
really do.
Go to the top.
Taking out to the public would be helpful. Living within the capacity of your facilities is critically important. For Chesapeake Beach, it has all the flexibility it needs in terms of accommodating growth. If it wanted to take a high growth approach, there's plenty of capacity in the wastewater treatment plant that handle high growth. There's plenty of capacity in a new school that's planned for the foreseeable future that would build out the town. And Bayside Road could be a constraining factor. But the way that we've talked about locating development is not to locate high traffic generators here or to locate housing here, but would be up on the Cox Road area on 260 so that the commuting traffic that would occur wouldn't burden this particular road. But these are all, we need to step back and go back to that. Okay. I mean, that's my feeling. If it's consensus of the group, bring out the municipal growth chapter, start from square one on it. Really helpful. I don't know that's going to resolve this sort of foundational philosophical issues, but at least everybody starts with the same information again. But I thought that we were headed to a much more restrictive plan that accommodated some amount of development, far less than the potential projections show. And the projection is here, and we're like this, and that the growth that was anything other than single family would be limited to Cox Road area and then integrate into a commercial center. The feeling being that residential can help promote and revitalize if it can be part of the cash flow on a commercial project. Mixed use projects work, but they have to be mixed use projects. You have to, and having residential there is out of floodplain. It's a beautiful natural location to live. So there's probably a market demand for that. And I've heard from people who own property who are looking for buying property, they would love it if the town had the potential to do something other than retail. Retail is not the strongest, as you know now, we only have 12 retail outlets in the town. This is half of what we had 10 years ago when we did the other plan. So, incorporating the multiple uses is valued and helps, but it has to be truly multiple uses, and it has to be in a way that makes it economically feasible to take down a building, build a new building under modern codes, do the sidewalks and street trees and the stormwater management facilities that will have a benefit for the entire community. There has to be a cash flow. There has to be development potential. And if the zoning ordinance doesn't allow development potential, those buildings will sit there for another couple of decades. Not that they're bad, not that there's a value being there, but they're underutilized. Since they're there, since they're commercial, since they're parking, since there's hard surfaces, since they have environmental impacts, they ought to make a bigger contribution to the qualities of the town. And that's what the Economic Development Committee has said. We should, I've invited them, but I think we should really, as a planning commission, invite them. Because they have said that they would like to see more commercial development opportunities. What would the town do if someone wanted to open up a brew pub? Someone does. Someone wanted to open up a brew pub. Instead, he's operating out of his house. We've had people who open up bakeries out of their house because they can't find space to rent for their businesses in the town. And that says something about the nature of the land economics in the town, that there's not enough space for people to take a risk to rent it or to move it. We have a business moving into one of the other buildings far bigger than she needs. To customize it for her use would be very expensive. So she's renting out a big space for a little business. If there was a demand, you can imagine if they could put another layer on that building with 3 or 4 apartments, it would cash flow, and they can use the money to reinvest in the building, improve the facade, plant some street trees, move the parking out of the dangerous situation that exists today into a safer position. Those things don't churn unless there's at least some modest development potential. That's just I wanted you to understand that. It's really critical, and that's what the Economic Development Committee has discussed, that we need more land for, we don't have much zoning for commercial development, and more zoning and properly positioned properties with respect to the market would promote a stronger tax base and more of these type of.
Chris, I was talking to somebody in North Beach this evening who
Trader.
is closing their store. They're selling everything because he's old, he's retired, he's sold the building. The fellow who bought the building, I said, well, what's he going to do with it? Has he got another renter coming in to open a store? And the woman said, no, he's probably going to tear the building down, build a mixed use, a 3-story to replace the 1-story building. So he has renters in the top 2 floors, which she speculated be $2,500 a month or something for each of those, which would support the retail on the first floor, whether they could fill it adequately or not. So I thought, that's kind of what you've been talking about.
In trying to measure the subjective terms, you pointed out 2 things I just want to bring to people's attention. You said that in the absence, that the current plan allows for, I'm just using your hand gestures, so there aren't numbers attached to them. If we did nothing, which was Bob's point, then we're sort of on this curve, and the plan as proposed does this. That reasonably accurate? So I don't know what the numbers are, 2%, 8%, I'm making that up. And then you said something else. Oh, there is more than enough infrastructure support in the town. So that's water, wastewater treatment. We think traffic studies based on what the Rod and Reel did, the school that's being built. There is enough infrastructure in the town to support this top growth, and yet we're on this sort of curve. So again, I don't want to say subjective, high, medium, or low, but we're clearly not maximizing. Maybe we're not minimizing. We're not at zero or negative, but we're clearly well below even a median of maximum and minimum. Is that a reasonable assessment of what the plan proposes? I think that's one way of looking at it.
And if you looked at the build out analysis and did like a theoretical analysis, look at the current zoning, what's allowed in the current zoning, and then what would be allowed under the plan. Just theoretically, the plan would represent a major course correction in development potential, because there's a significant part of the town that's zoned residential village, which allows, as you saw, projects come before you that were come while you were here, taller buildings. All someone has to do is consolidate a couple parcels, combine with a neighbor, and they can pop up a building. 32,000 square feet lot, which is well less than an acre, could accommodate a building of 6 condos. Perfectly feasible in this market, and I think that it would flow perfectly well. And that project at Sunrise on the Bay was a 12-unit building, big building, a lot different than the cottages around it. That's what exists today over broad stretches of the historic town. And what this plan says is drafted, I mean, as we're drafting it, is the only development that would be allowed in those areas would be a single family house. So, but those some areas like on Cox Road and integrated with this town center idea, their zoning would stay the same. Maybe it needs to be tweaked a little bit to facilitate revitalization, but the essential development potential would remain there, but it would be curtailed everywhere else. There's no way that you can consider that a pro-growth or anything other than a slow growth plan for Chesapeake Beach future. I think the idea is what benefits does growth provide? Well, redevelopment introduces residential uses maybe ought to be tied to specific reasonable advantages that it provides to the town, like revitalizing commercial properties, improving the aesthetics of certain areas, building sidewalks and pedestrian ways, contributing to parks, moving development out of the floodplains, things like that. When you think about that, the way the plan is doesn't do a lot of that, but it does point in that direction. It could do a lot more, but that would be more of a growth plan. But a restricted slow growth plan can improve those objectives. There's other goals. It certainly provides housing and more affordable housing opportunities for folks, higher quality rental properties for families that are priced out of living in Calvert County as a whole, which is a fundamental objective too we're asked to consider.
Chris, one of the things we've talked about is changing that area north of the fire station to a resource conservation area, the big grassy area there along 261. That was to have 2 18-unit condos on it, and which, if approved and if it becomes a resource conservation area, is not going to have 36 families living there. So the plan does incorporate, in my view, a slower growth approach.
Don't
I would say that everything is slow growth to very, very high growth.
One of the things that frustrates me about this discussion is when I have a problem and I have difficulty with something, what I like to do is propose an alternative. What I'd like to hear is the alternative being proposed, because all I hear is this isn't right, or this won't work, or I don't like this and I don't like that. You know what I mean? It's like bring me another rock, and I'm I get frustrated with that approach.
It puts some things in the box.
I think we'll wrap up the comprehensive plan part of the discussion tonight, but I do have two things if it's, I just want to mention to everybody. So there's a regional planning commissioners workshop in St. Mary's County. I think a couple of you have signed up or expressed interest in going. I think Fran passed out a flyer to everybody. If you don't have it, it's a good opportunity. It is September 25th from 10 to 3 down in Leonardtown. So if anybody's interested in going to it, shoot your name to you, Fran, or just sign up or.
I
Okay,
cannot make it.
neither can I. But just want to make sure everybody's aware of it. I think some stuff went out on it in case you missed it. I know sometimes I don't get to all my email stuff. So those of you who are attending, I appreciate it. I think it'll be useful and give you a chance to. I think one of the great things about any of these training opportunities is the discussion with some of our counterparts who do this in other areas and different things like that. So make some contacts, ask questions. Okay, that's all right. All right, good. I appreciate it. I think it'll be valuable. I'm glad you guys are expressing interest in it. I think it only helps the process. So I appreciate that. Maybe it's two other things. So if on the list of activities going on this weekend, I know there's a Taste of the Beaches, I think, and I know they're walking. Well, my schedule's been. I don't know the time. I don't want to commit to the times. I think it's Saturday.
I thought I saw your name on the volunteer
Oh,
list. I'm disappointed.
Not that I don't want to. It's just not going to work. There's going to be stuff set up over here at Kellum's and different places, and the walkability committee is going to have a ad hoc booth there. I think I saw today. Is that what I saw today?
Melissa, planning
Oh, is that-
professional, will be there
Okay.
to get feedback from the
Okay.
town.
And so I wasn't sure who all was going to be there. I talked to Holly today briefly about it, and it dovetails into the second thing and kind of a little bit of what some of the discussion was tonight. Again, it is a challenge, and I think we struggled with it. I spent a lot of time when we had our first public engagement down there to really try to explain the purpose of the comprehensive plan and how we're going to work through this and what it does and what it doesn't, what it is and what it is not. And sometimes the what it is not is almost as important as what it is. So you're right. People know us, especially now that we're on TV. We're not famous, but we are maybe more recognizable than we were. So people are going to stop you and ask you questions. People are going to talk to you. Again, take that advantage to maybe just talk about the process and listen. I think when people engage us outside of these meetings, be in listening mode, maybe less in talking mode. And I try to just listen, try to understand what it is they're concerned about, and maybe do some of those course corrections of, that's not exactly what we're doing right now. Here's what we are doing. It's a deliberative process. It's an engagement process. I can tell you without a doubt, because I had a conversation with them, we are not, especially as a planning body, in the position of buying up property or encouraging. None of us on here are developers. We're trying to engage. We're trying to create an environment that makes the town successful from a zoning and a development perspective. Luckily, we're not in that business, but just sometimes people think we are. Take that opportunity to say, look, that's not what we do. That's not what we do as a planning body. We're trying to understand the needs. We're trying to create a vision for where the town goes and create a framework so that it can be successful. But be in that listening mode, and maybe they have misconceptions about what we do, how we do it, why some things exist, why some things don't, and say, hey, take that time to encourage them to either watch us on live stream or come up here on a Wednesday night and be part of the process. And I would just throw that out there, and that's kind of what I try to do when people stop me, want to talk to me, and we're all good spokesmen. So take that opportunity, but make sure we're in the listening mode, because I think it's important. It is that they are going to come up to us because they have ideas. Everybody's got ideas, and some are better than others. But again, it's important to hear from folks. And I know you all do that, based on what you've said tonight. So I don't want to discourage that, but I do want to, sometimes we have to take that opportunity to make sure they understand the process and where we are rolling along here. And we're going to be at this for a while longer. I know we had I thought it was overly ambitious at the beginning. We've taken longer than I said we were going to take as we got into this process, but I think this is going to take even we're going to work through this, and it's going to take some time, and we're not going to be having a document ready for public consumption in the next 3 months or anything like that. So we want to keep making improvements to what some of the stuff Chris is editing. I apologize for me not being able to get constructive comments into some of the parts of that discussion tonight, but I will try and read it. I'd ask you all to do the same, and we'll keep working through it. So I appreciate everybody's time tonight. Any comments from anybody before we go out tonight?
The only thing I'd recommend, Chris, is I thought the maps, we need better maps. The issues that we talk about in this section are really narrowly focused, like on the north end or on and the people that will be reading this report in the future, they'll have a specific interest. They'll be in one area and they'll want to see how that affects them. And so a larger map, maybe take the map, split it in half, or focus on particular areas so you can see where do I live, would be helpful.
Will that be interactive in the plan if we post it on a portal? And
I was going to say, because when I look at them in Dropbox, I can zoom in and see a great amount of detail. So the electronic versions are definitely richer than the paper versions.
Right.
You see the maps that are called Zone 1, 2, and 3. Like there's a sub area map for the north side and sub area for.
Yeah.
You would like more specific or more?
I'll send you a note with some of my thoughts, but there needs to be a little more explanation, I think, for as you're reading through it, you're saying the Wesley Stennett area, and where is, for the uninitiated, where is that? And so a map that would show some of these communities that are discussed in the plan would be helpful. So the person reading it knows where you're talking about.
I really thank you for that. I talked to Bob today too about his input on some of the maps too. Particularly those sea level rise maps were done through a great deal of labor. It sort of took a lot of time to get through that, and with the experts down at Salisbury State University and me. So I really want those maps in particular to be worth the effort and sort of communicating to people all this content that we've layered on top of it, I do think the digital maps, the PDFs, are really effective.
Yeah, they're much better when you can zoom into them.
But if you have any other feedback, content that we can add to the maps to sort of clarify them, to make the maps themselves almost be a standalone resource. And a number of them I've printed out or have at 24 by 36, so for meetings we can have them up with big maps. And we could do that with all of them, actually. But the writing of the drafts, tying them into maps is really critical. And you're right, I can really do a better job of it. So people know it. When we say Wesley Stennett, there's an arrow pointing to that section of the map. Good. Okay.
I really appreciated the first portion of your plan where you presented the concept of a holistic approach to the issues of the water surrounding us. I can tell you spent a lot of time on that, and I think that's a good conceptual thing for us to think about, regardless of the little details that we talked about. I appreciate that you did that.
9:45. While I don't always agree or share the opinions of my committee members, I have a huge amount of respect for each and every one of you, your tenacity and your willingness to be here till 9:45. I'm sure I share it, but here I am. Strike that from the minutes.
Additions I would like to make to the park and recreational use area. Is there a way we can go back on that
Yeah.
next time around?
Yeah,
I don't mean tonight, but I mean like next time.
yeah, and if you have some suggestions, go ahead and make them to Chris, and then we can talk about them next. I mean, don't wait till next time. Shoot.
Shoot you an email.
Yeah, sure.
Perfect.
There, if there's no other comments, is there a motion to adjourn the meeting tonight? Second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
The ayes have it. The meeting's adjourned for September 11th, 2019. Thank you.
Yes. He's been out all week, and it's like back to school, back to sports, back to, because, well, you know the first part of
Town
it,
went
that
through
part
there.
sucked.
Yeah,